Okay, hey everybody, how's it going? Happy Saturday to you. Thank you for being on the hot zone. There's a whole lot going on as usual, and we are not going to be able to get to it all. They had 3 more hostages released in Gaza, and I could do a whole live about what's going on there. I'll have to get to that maybe tomorrow. Not tomorrow. I'm trying not to do lives on Sunday. Monday, I guess, we'll do lives. Thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate all of your support and uh, doing a lot of work to put extra information up on chuckholton.com. Trying to take all the research that's being done. It's not just me now. I've got a whole team working on it. Putting this research together, putting it into a format that you can copy and paste and share. If you need ammunition as you're having discussions around the water cooler at work or at church or with your friends or family about what's going on. There's just so much disinformation out there. That's one of the things we're going to talk about here today. So much disinformation, and it's really hard to, well, kind of break through the noise, separate the signal from the noise. And there are so many parties that are actively trying to mislead you for whatever agenda they hold. And so the purpose of the hot zone is to try to give you a boots on the ground perspective, take my own experience from the places that we're talking about, and my 20 plus years experience as a war correspondent, and sort of help you read between the lines so that you can understand better the things that you see in the news. Because you kind of do have to read between the lines. You can't take anything at face value anymore. There's just too much politics that has invaded the everything. And so today we're going to talk about asymmetric warfare, which is taking place all across the globe. But specifically today, we're going to talk about Russia's asymmetric warfare against the West. Now, Russia has to, the first thing you have to understand is that Russia has to engage in asymmetric warfare because, from a conventional warfare standpoint, they just don't have the ability to compete with the West. Russia's true combat power, even with a 1 million-man army, is something like the Texas National Guard. Their economy is in shambles. They are literally, in terms of what they call purchasing power parity, PPP, which is a good way to measure one country's GDP against another. They are somewhere in the range of Greece, or a little less than Italy. And Greece is sort of the problem child of Europe. I mean, Greece is no economic powerhouse by any stretch. So Russia being about the level of Greece or Slovakia says a lot, even though it's the largest country in the world. That space, they have a lot of space, but in a lot of ways that works against them. It's the same kind of thing that happened in Detroit. Let me explain. When you had capital flight away from Detroit, when Detroit started going downhill, which is about the time that it was taken over by Democrats, and they started turning Detroit into Dependistan, putting everybody on government programs and taxing the living daylights out of everything that wasn't nailed down and most things that were. People started leaving. The crime got bad, violence got bad, homelessness got bad, taxes were super high. To this day, you can buy a house in Detroit for $1. I mean, a nice house, like a Victorian mansion, for $1, because there are tens of thousands, about 45,000 homes that have been literally abandoned by their owners. Why would anybody do that? Why would you have a nice 2-story, Victorian home, not even in that bad a shape, and just walk away from it and say it's not even worth it to live in it or even try to sell it, because the taxes are so high that people couldn't, even if your house was paid off, they couldn't afford the tax bill every year. And so they just walked away. And when the population of Detroit went from 800,000 or 850,000 down to about 350,000 because of capital flight, well, the government is still responsible for providing essential services to the city. And you understand the city hasn't gotten smaller. There are fewer people, but it's still the same distance from one side to the other. And if anything, they need more in terms of emergency services and things like that than they did before, because it's just so dysfunctional and unhealthy. And so the tax base dropped by more than half. The vast majority of the people who left were the taxpayers in Detroit. And so the tax base dropped by 60, 70%. But yet they still need the same number of firefighters. They still need the same number of police officers. They still need the same number of garbage trucks and snow plows and everything else. And they just don't have the budget for any of that stuff. So when I was there reporting on it, this is years ago, at the end of the Obama administration, or the first Obama administration, was talking to some firefighters, and they were saying, we actually invested our own retirement funds apart from the city, because the city was so mismanaged and rife with corruption that we didn't trust the government to invest our retirement funds. So we did that ourselves and had our own retirement fund. And just the other day, the city came and confiscated our retirement funds and said, we need these because we got to prop up the one that failed. And I just lost my whole retirement, basically. So I tell that as a story to help you, as an example, understand where Russia is. Russia has the largest land mass of any country on planet Earth, but they're a tiny little country in reality. Their country is smaller than Florida in terms of GDP. They are in terminal decline in terms of their demographics. So they're having so few children that they are losing about 1 million people a year just to people dying off and then not being replaced. 1 million people a year just disappearing. They don't take in much in the way of migrants. And the vast majority of the wealth in the country is concentrated in the hands of very few people. The wealth gap in Russia is, well, 6, 7, 8 times what it is in the United States. And so if you took the top, I don't know, 500 wealthiest people out of Russia, the economy of Russia, or the total gross domestic product, would decline by, so we're talking about, again, the top 500 people, the GDP of Russia would probably decline by 30%. I mean, it's huge, it's massive. So even though they have a large army in terms of numbers right now, because they have mobilized a lot of people to fight in Ukraine, not enough because they have to buy troops from North Korea. I would have said rent them, but they're not giving them back. The troops that are coming from North Korea are on a one-way trip into Russia. Kim Jong-un is getting paid handsomely for those troops, but those troops are probably not going to ever see home again. The Ukrainian military has intel from the very few North Korean troops that they have captured that says that North Korean troops are being instructed by North Korea to commit suicide rather than get captured. And if you get captured and don't commit suicide, your family will be put into a concentration camp in North Korea. So Russia is buying these people. They're cheaper than the death benefits they have to pay out on Russian soldiers, and so that's why they're going with North Korean soldiers. And it's not working out too well. These North Korean soldiers just don't, because they've never been out of North Korea, they don't understand modern warfare at all. There's some reports coming out from South Korean intel, actually, because they were thinking that they were grabbing farmers and laborers out of the fields in North Korea, putting them in uniforms and shipping them to Ukraine. But that's actually not the case. According to South Korean intel, these are the cream of the crop of North Korean soldiers. They're sending North Korean special forces into Russia, and even they are just no match for any kind of modern combined arms warfare. I don't mean to paint too bleak a picture for Russia, because Russia has been making gains over the past year in Ukraine, although a lot has been made about those gains. But if you put them in perspective, at the rate they're going, it'll take them, they already hold 98% of Donetsk province. And at the rate that they're advancing in Ukraine, it's still going to take them 3 years to take the other 2%. And at the rate they're losing soldiers, like 12 to 20,000 troops a month in terms of casualties, not deaths, but deaths and injuries, it will be stratospherically costly for Russia to do that. They have now started finding Russian positions instead of armored personnel carriers or even military trucks to transport their equipment and ammunition. They are finding stables with donkeys on the battlefield that Russia is now using to transport supplies, because they just are running out of functional military equipment. They are putting any resources they have, though, into missiles and drones technology, because they are starting to realize that's kind of where it's at right now. Ukraine, I want to say that Donald Trump becoming the president of the United States, getting elected again, caused a lot of consternation among the Ukrainians and among the leaders of Western Europe, NATO, and the UN. But in reality, I would say that Donald Trump becoming president of the United States will end up being the best thing that could have happened to Ukraine, in terms of I mean, there's a lot of talk about that Trump is going to force them to accept a bad deal to essentially lose the war in order to stop the war. We haven't seen the actual peace plan yet that Donald Trump is set to release next week, but several leaked copies have come out, but there is a lot of speculation that those leaks are actually Russian disinformation. They've been leaked. They're wishful thinking by Russia. They're putting this stuff out. We'll find out when Donald Trump unveils his peace plan next week. And I think that it's going to be, without a doubt, a compromise. It's going to require compromise on the part of Ukraine. But I think just the fact that Trump was getting elected and everybody was afraid he was going to cut off aid for Ukraine has forced Ukraine to really double down on becoming more self-sufficient in terms of their weaponry. And so they've started mass producing long-range explosive suicide drones inside Ukraine, and they've started hitting Russian infrastructure. They came to realize, like the light bulb went on for Ukraine, and they're like, we've been massacring Russian troops on the front lines for 3 years now, and Russia has taken much bigger losses than Ukraine has in terms of numbers, and that's provable. I mean, that's third-party open source intelligence has been able to ascertain that Russian battlefield losses have far outstripped Ukraine's. But then again, Russia has a much deeper well of troops and equipment to draw from, and so Russia just doesn't care. They just keep sending troops, and they can take, oh gosh, millions of, thank you, GJ. They can take millions of poor Russian peasant, men and throw them into the front lines. They can buy tens, if not hundreds of thousands of North Korean troops. And so they can, in a war of attrition that's purely a war of attrition, Russia has the upper hand because they just have so much more to attrit. They have so much more in terms of people, and they had stockpiles of ammunition and things like that. Now they are getting low. I mean, it's easy to see if you watch this closely, with all of the footage coming out from the drones and cameras that are on the battlefield in Ukraine. It's easy to see that the Russians are getting to the point where they are they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. But it's a very big barrel. So that doesn't mean that they couldn't continue to fight and eventually wear out the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainians at the moment have a larger combined force under arms than the Russians do in Ukraine. About 800,000 to Russia's 650,000 or so. And these are massive armies when you think about it. They're, almost 1 million men on each side. I mean, it's crazy. In the last couple of days, I'm just giving you this as context. Okay, we're going to get to talk about the asymmetric war part of this in a minute. But in the last couple of days, the Russian attacks around Pokrovsk, where I went down there in December when I was in Ukraine, and the Russians had been making steady gains around Pokrovsk, and they thought they were going to take Pokrovsk, and essentially they have all but turned Pokrovsk into a field of rubble at this point. It was a city of like 40,000 people. It's gone. There's just like almost not one stone left upon another at this point. But the Russian attacks there have slackened considerably in the last week. And nobody's exactly sure why, but they're thinking that the Russians are either trying to refit and kind of regroup and then hit a different place again, or start another, save up their combat power for when the spring comes. But right now is the time that Russia typically would be at its height in terms of attacks and stuff, because the ground should be frozen, and that way their tanks can move off of the roads. But they're not using tanks much anymore because they just get killed so fast by swarms of suicide drones. So they're essentially using tanks as artillery from far behind the front lines, and that's about it. So it's interesting that they were making gains around Pokrovsk and they have stopped. And I thought by now, even when I was there in December, they would have completely enveloped Pokrovsk and they'd be moving on the next, coming toward Kramatorsk. They were only 5 or 10 miles away from Kramatorsk when I was in Kramatorsk in December. But they're still about the same spot they were at when I was there. In Kursk, the region of Russia that the Ukrainians have pushed into, however, in the last 3 days, the Ukrainians have broken through Russian lines and have taken quite a bit more ground. That was the place where Russia was throwing some of its strongest forces to try to push the Ukrainians out of Russian territory. So I don't exactly know what this means, but this is, again, coming from open source intelligence like War Mapper and the other open source live UA maps, stuff like that. So all of that to say, we're here February 22nd of this month will be the 3-year anniversary of this war. It'll have been gone on for 3 solid years. And we're coming out with a short documentary that gives you a timeline of the progress that has been made and how things have changed throughout the war. From my, 7 or 8 different trips to Ukraine, I spent a grand total of more than 6 months in the country since the war started, since before the war started. And so we're putting together kind of a summary to help you kind of understand how the war has progressed. But suffice it to say, Russia has not come very close to achieving the goal of demilitarizing Ukraine, stopping Ukraine from joining with the European Union, making a buffer between Russia and the rest of the West because they're worried about NATO. What Russia did by attacking Ukraine has essentially made the growth of NATO a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of Russia. We've seen several other Baltic states that have joined NATO since the war in Ukraine started, specifically because of Russia's threat. We have seen a tremendous increase in the amount of military spending by NATO countries, especially Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Sweden. And all of that puts Russia much further from their stated goals than they were at the beginning of the war. There were no Nazis in Ukraine. There were no bioweapons labs in Ukraine. If you don't believe me on that, you have been the victim of Russian disinformation. Point, period, end of story. You can go, I just put an article on chuckholton.com that lays it out in black and white. If you have a family member, a relative, or a coworker who is still beating that drum about bioweapons labs that were actively creating viruses that specifically would target Russia or something like that in Ukraine, go get that article I just posted on chuckholton.com and share it with them, because that is still a thing. I can't believe it's still a thing. It was even a thing in Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation hearing. She actually walked back from where her previous statements she's made in the past, where she has said that Russia had a right to invade Ukraine because the United States was building weapons labs to threaten Russia in Ukraine. It's patently untrue. She walked that back a little bit in her confirmation hearings, but she's still wrong on the matter. She still doesn't understand that, for example, Ukraine cannot hold elections until the war is over because its constitution says You cannot hold elections during wartime. And it wouldn't be fair to the several million people who are either in Russian occupied territory that are Ukrainian. How do they vote on a new a new Ukrainian president? How do all the people that are outside of Ukraine as refugees still vote if they have elections? So the Ukrainian constitution literally says you cannot have an election during a time of war. So Volodymyr Zelensky did not cancel the elections, but Tulsi Gabbard still thinks that he did. She still doesn't understand it, which says to me something about whether or not she ought to be the director of national intelligence. But there you go. Now, because of all this, the economic hits on Russia, Ukraine has struck 9 out of Russia's 10 largest oil depots in the last 3 weeks. And they've taken Russian energy supplies that down probably 10% or more. And they're continuing to do that. And so they're hitting Russia in the pocketbook. And that is where Ukraine realizes that's, if we're going to be able to pull this off, we're not going to do it on the front lines in Ukraine. We're going to do it behind the front lines in Russia by striking infrastructure and energy inside Russia. And Russia is starting to understand we are not going to win on the front lines in Ukraine either. The only chance Russia has of pulling this off is through what I call scare tactics. And a scare is an acronym. So get out your pen and pencil because I'm going to go over this acronym with you and help you understand Russia's scare tactics. And this is just a way to help you remember the different elements of what they call asymmetric warfare. Okay, asymmetric warfare is warfare by means other than the kinetic battle space on the front lines. So, one tired mama says, what stops Russia from starting up all this again with another nation in the future? Well, what Ukraine is saying is we've got to not just bring the war to a stop. We have to beat Russia so badly that they won't be able to do this again. What the fundamental misunderstanding there is that the major push, the major effort that Russia is making in this war is not happening on the battlefield. It's happening in other arenas, which I'm about to go through. And in reality, the actual war that is taking place right now is not between Russia and Ukraine, and it's not even happening in Ukraine. That is kind of a sideshow. The actual war that is taking place right now is between Russia and the West, and it's taking place in the West. And it's taking place through these scare tactics. Again, SCARE is an acronym that I'm going to go through right now. So the S in SCARE stands for sabotage. Russia has been ramping up its efforts to sabotage infrastructure and energy and other things like telecommunications in Europe over the past 6 months to a year. You can go all the way back to the Nord Stream pipeline attacks. And the culprit, who attacked the Nord Stream pipeline, who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, well, they still don't have hard evidence, hard proof, one way or the other. They know that there was a group of people, not Ukrainian military, not Ukrainian government, but just pro-Ukrainian people from Poland who had rented a yacht in the Baltic Sea sometime around when the Nord Stream pipeline blew up. But there were also a lot of Russian ghost fleet ships in the area as well, and even Russian military ships. So the real question when it comes to who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline is who had the greater motivation to do so, motivation and wherewithal. The Ukrainians are far from the Baltics. It'd be very hard for the Ukrainians to get a team of people to the Baltics to go do this without getting picked up somewhere or seen or without leaving a trace. The Russians have direct access to the Baltics, so it's much easier for the Russians. So in terms of wherewithal, it's more likely the Russians did it. In terms of motivation, it's kind of six and one half dozen of the other, because while Russia built the Nord Stream pipeline, so you might think, well, they wouldn't want it to be blown up, it had already been cut off. And Russia could see that they were not going to profit from that pipeline anytime in the near future anyway. And so they might have decided that it had more strategic value to blow it up and then blame it on the United States or Ukraine. The other player in this is the United States, and it certainly is possible. There's a non-zero chance that the United States blew it up. And I have friends who are convinced that that's exactly what happened. That's something that is an interesting discussion, without a doubt. And I won't dismiss that out of hand, that the U.S. was involved. But Russia did certainly have motivation to see that blown up so that they could blame it on the West. And it really was not valuable to them in any other way, so why not? Ukraine, on the other hand, had motivation, had reason to want to see across Ukraine anymore and continue to pay Ukraine the transport fees that it was receiving. That's understandable as well. So they both had a possible motive for that. Whoops, says my bit rate's low. What am I connected to here? Just a second. Okay, did I cut out on you? Am I still here? I'm broadcasting on Starlink, so we'll have to see if that clears up at all here in a second. Might have just had a cloud go. I don't know. It doesn't seem like clouds affect the Starlink all that much, but sometimes it does cause some issues. It does kind of come and go. Okay, so it was better now. So I thought I was on the Starlink. I actually was connected to the Panamanian internet, which is not that reliable. Okay, so when it comes to the gas pipeline that was blown up, Nord Stream, it's 50-50, I would say, with some small chance the United States was involved. That's 2022. Since 2024, though, there have been a whole lot of mysterious undersea cable attacks where cables have been cut, either electricity cables or communications cables, or uh, could be other things. And it has been proven that Russia was engaging in sabotage against those cables. Russia has a long history of using energy as blackmail, cutting electrical supplies, natural gas, to try to force European nations or their own Russian satellite nations into doing what Russia wants them to do. So it's sort of a no-brainer when you see cables start getting cut around the Baltic that Russia is behind it. And that has been proven now. That's one of the reasons why Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia just today cut their connection to the Russian power grid. So when the Soviet Union was a thing, they built out an absolutely massive power grid in the 1940s and 50s, all across the Soviet Union, all of their satellite countries, to include Armenia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, et cetera, et cetera. And they were all connected into one grid. Well, when the Soviet Union broke up, you can't just chop that grid up. It's still one grid. And as Russia has made a habit of using that fact as blackmail to put pressure on countries that were no longer in the Soviet sphere of influence, and they wanted to put pressure on Armenia to get Armenia to, stick with Russia, whatever. Well, they could always turn off that natural gas pipeline, or they could always turn off the electricity. I have said this before. If you've been watching me for some time, I'll say it again. One of the biggest reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine has nothing to do with Nazis, nothing to do with biolabs, nothing to do with militarization, nothing even to do with NATO. It had to do with the fact that there are 9 nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and they were all tied into the Russian grid. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant alone, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, supplied power to approximately 4 million households, or 12 million people inside Russia. Russia's only got, what, 150 million people? So 4 million isn't huge, but it's not tiny either. 12 million people, 4 million households. It's approximately 10% of well, it's actually less than that because it was also supplying electricity to Ukraine. But suffice it to say, Russia did not want to lose all of that power generation capability that Ukraine represented. Russia has a huge network. They've got 36 nuclear power plants inside Russia. But all of these things were built in the 1950s. They have done very little until just recently to improve or upgrade their power generation system. And so their power system is extremely fragile, just like the United States, by the way. There's a warning here for the US. The US power grid was built about the same time, and we still have ultra high energy transformers that are, were meant to last like 20 years, and they were put in place in the 1950s. And so they've been there for 60, 70 years. And we don't just have a stockpile of these that we can just swap them out because they're custom built. And if they go bad, it takes up to 2 years to rebuild a new one. And there's no place in the United States that builds them. So we have to get these massive, 200-ton transformers built in South Korea or Brazil. So it's really, really a threat to the United States that we haven't upgraded our power grid. Hopefully that's something Donald Trump will address during his term. But Russia's in the same boat, and worse, because while they have a large excess power generation capability, and they're a net power exporter even still, they export power to Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and to China and India and places like that. They still were not excited at all about 9 nuclear power plants that were plugged into their grid going offline and connecting to the European power grid. Now, that's not as simple as just flipping a switch. Okay, we don't want to be on Russia's anymore, so we're going to disconnect the wires from theirs and plug into Europe's. It's not like that. It's a completely different wavelengths, completely different. Everything's completely different. And so it's a massive undertaking to switch over from the Russian grid to the European grid. But Ukraine had been saying they were going to do that for some time, ever since like 2008, I think. And Russia had been saying, don't do it. We're not going to allow it. We won't allow you to do it. And Ukraine's like, no, we're going to do it. And Russia's like, no, you're not. We're not going to let you do it. Well, Ukraine made the first test where they disconnected the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant and connected it to the European grid on the same day that the war started in 2022. Actually, 4 hours after Ukraine conducted that test and turned off their power to Russia and turned it on to Europe. 4 hours later, Russia attacked. And what was one of the very first objectives that the Russian military undertook to accomplish? Retake the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which they then reconnected to the Russian power grid, or tried to, except for the fact, and they would have reconnected it and turned it back on and everything's fine. But the people who ran that power plant were Ukrainian, and they wouldn't play ball. And so there is a skeleton crew of Ukrainian engineers on site just to make sure that that power plant doesn't actually melt down, but it is essentially turned off at this point. So again, another self-fulfilling prophecy. Russia was worried about losing power generation capacity out of Ukraine. Well, by attacking Ukraine, they got Ukraine fast-tracked into the European system. And as of March 2022, Ukraine has been on the European system. But strangely enough, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were not. They were still on the Russian system up until today. So all of that is because of Russian sabotage. Now, the C in S.C.A.R.E, we're going back to S.C.A.R.E tactics by Russia. S is sabotage, C is cyber warfare. Russia has been full court press against the West in the cyber realm for over a decade. There was a massive attack in 2014 where Russia took down Ukraine's entire power grid. When you talk to people in Ukraine, that was one of those events where everybody remembers where they were when the power went out, because it wasn't just the power, it was the banking system. Nobody could get money out. They couldn't pump fuel. Everything went offline. Everything in 2014. And as it turns out, Russia probably had the capability to do that to the United States, and them doing it to Ukraine was a warning shot to the US. It's still an open question whether or not Russian hackers have backdoors into the US power system, water system, hydroelectric dams. They could, they have literally found Russian zero-day exploits sitting on American infrastructure systems, meaning the Russians have penetrated our systems. They've installed a package of malware that is then sitting on the system, just waiting for the trigger to be sent. It's like Russian sappers have wormed their way into power plants, dams, hospitals, water treatment facilities, internet backbone providers, and many more things. Government entities, the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, got massively hacked by Russian hackers and Chinese hackers. They stole the very intimate details of anybody who's ever had had or applied for a secret security clearance. all of their, I mean, because you have to give up very, very, very personal information in order to apply for a secret security clearance. And hackers got in from Russia or China and stole the information of about 12 million Americans, myself included, just, I don't know, what is it, 5, 6 years ago. Massive hack. It's almost like these guys have planted explosives in all of these systems across the United States. And all it takes is them just a few keystrokes, sending a trigger code, and they could shut down the American power supply for years. It'd take 2 years to get it back online. They could open the floodgates at dams across the United States and literally have tsunamis of water rushing down on small towns and cities across the United States. They could shut off medical devices. They could, I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And Russia is among the world's best at cyber warfare. And so there were the NotPetya attacks in 2017 targeted Ukraine again, but they found out that, and that cost billions to Ukraine, by the way, but it found out that they were also, that same attack was inside companies like Maersk and FedEx. These attacks could be used to bring planes down, to literally cause planes to drop out of the sky. The SolarWinds hack in 2020, Russian hackers infiltrated the US government agencies and stole critical data. And now with AI-driven cyber software, they could launch a digital 9/11 against the United States or other Western nations. And I really think that it's not a matter of if that happens, it's just a matter of when. The real question is, what will the United States do to mitigate the effects of one of those attacks before it happens? Because this is like spending a lot of extra money to put sprinklers, to put a sprinkler system in your house. You're like, what are the chances? I mean, our house has never burned down. What are the chances it's going to burn down? It'd be really expensive to put in a sprinkler system. So we'll just buy a couple of, you know, fire extinguishers and call it good. Well, that's fine unless your house catches fire and it, you know, actually does burn down. And when you're talking about one person's house, well, that can be easily rebuilt. But when you're talking about the entire US power grid, that's another story. I made a documentary about that, and you can watch that documentary along with many of my 65 plus documentaries over at chuckholton.com as a supporter. If you're a supporter over there, you get access to all of those and you can download them and watch them. So the A in S.C.A.R.E tactics, S.C.A.R.E, the A stands for assassinations. Believe it or not, Russia has been targeting their enemies abroad for many years. They send covert hit squads around the world to conduct targeted assassinations against their adversaries. If you speak out against Vladimir Putin, there's a good chance that your cup of tea, your next cup of tea, is going to have polonium in it. That was what happened to one of the top opposition leaders. They've used polonium, they've used the nerve agent Novichok in the United Kingdom to take out Russian spy Sergei Skripal. Anthony Navalny was poisoned and nearly died in 2020 by another Novichok poisoning. He eventually died in captivity in Russia. There have been at least 40 Russian oligarchs who have accidentally committed suicide with 3 shots to the back of their heads, or fallen out of a window in a 40-story building just coincidentally after they criticized the war or Vladimir Putin. Many of them have died in plane crashes and others. It's just amazing how these jets just fall out of the sky, and they're much more likely to do so if you say something against Vladimir Putin. So assassinations are part and parcel of the Russian playbook. And now we're getting into the stuff that you've all been exposed to. You may not have been assassinated by Russian spies or known anybody who was. You may not have been the victim of cyber warfare, although you probably have been, you just don't know it. But you've definitely been subject to disinformation and psychological warfare through Russian attacks. Definitely. If you live in the United States or in the West, you have been targeted by Russian disinformation campaigns. It's not just a hobby of some pimply faced kids in his mom's basement in Moscow. This is actual Kremlin war strategy. Russia floods the internet with false stories to confuse the public. That's the whole point of it, and turn people against their own government. As I have gone around the United States reporting on disasters and riots over the past 10 years, every time I go to report on something bad that's happening in the United States, there is a disproportionate number of Russian news outlets, Russian state media outlets that are there covering Antifa riots, Black Lives Matter riots, pulling down statues, even protests against uh, the Second Amendment, even abortion protests. Anything that actually gay pride. I accidentally found myself in a gay pride parade in San Francisco one time. Holy cow, was that an eye-opening experience? But there were tons of Russian media outlets there. I was like, what is up with that? They are trying to give their people and your people the impression that things are much worse in America than they really are. You'll find Russian outlets reporting on the disasters in California right now after the fires in the Palisades, in Tennessee after the hurricanes that went through there. But when you look at the packages that they report, or that they actually put out, if you go watch Russian media, which I do, what you'll see is that they never report on the good work that Good Samaritans do as they bring in at their own expense food, water, shelter. They won't report on the Amish that have come down and built bridges and culverts and roads and houses for the people in Tennessee. They're just going to report on people complaining that the government isn't there helping them. And they're doing that to divide Americans. That's what their plan is. They have literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of fake social media accounts that not just spread this disinformation, going back to the Nazis in Ukraine or the bioweapons labs, or if you found yourself believing that Volodymyr Zelensky has been buying yachts and villas in Europe with the money that the United States is sending to Ukraine, it's patently false. I tracked it down. It's just not true. If you found yourself believing that, you were a victim of Russian disinformation. Point, period, end of story. These fake social media accounts don't just start those rumors, they amplify them. And they retweet. Well, that's a hard word to say. And get this stuff out there. The last one is probably the most egregious. I don't know. I think they're much more effective at disinformation and information war than they are at any other kind of warfare. I think that is where they really win. The Russians understand how to divide Americans. They know where the chinks in our armor are, and they know how to weasel their way in there and chisel away any kind of patriotic feeling that we might have toward one another. And that's something we need to be on our guard against. But the last part of this acronym is election interference. So scare tactics, and the E at the end is election interference. They have done everything they could for many election cycles, well before 2016, to manipulate US elections and lots of other countries' elections as well. Ukrainian elections have had a really hard time with this. And that's why many of these countries have gone back to paper ballots, because they're smarter than our country is. It's much harder to hack paper ballots. But Russia, they don't just support one party either. They just do whatever they can to foment unrest, division, and confusion. So let me give you an example of how they hack American elections. There are each side, the Democrats and the Republicans, as they're coming up to the presidential election, they are doing a tremendous amount of research on every, very, very granular research on every county in America to decide which ones are already in our camp, which ones are definitely never going to be in our camp, and which ones are in play. And it's those counties that are in play that might be able to be swayed into the Democrat camp or the Republican camp that they really focus on. So whether it's the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee, they do these studies and they have a computer, spreadsheets. They have software that tracks all this stuff in real time. And it helps them spend their money where it's going to be most effective. So, it costs like $5 billion now to run for president. And that money gets spent on targeted ads at the people that they think they can sway. They don't spend a ton of money on ads in places that are already going to be on their side. Why would you? What's the point? And they don't spend a ton of money in places they know they're going to lose. Because again, what's the point? It's those ones in the middle. And if there are some purple counties that Democrats think that they can win, they'll put their money over there. So here's how they get hacked. Those databases are not, very difficult to get into. I sat with a hacker one time in Dallas at a karaoke bar, and he pulled it out of his laptop and literally showed me on screen how he could hack into these databases. And then it's just a simple spreadsheet. And they have a score, like a 1 to 5. How likely is this county to vote for our party? And you could change those. You could change those scores. So he says nothing for Russian hackers to get in there and monkey with the numbers to cause one party or the other to end up spending money in places that are already in their camp or are never going to be in their camp by manipulating the numbers to show that they're actually still in play. So that's just one very easy way that Russia can monkey with our election process. And it might seem minor, but it's not. It's actually huge. And I would add, it's an act of war. This is why I'm pointing this out to you, because by using these scare tactics, okay, sabotage, cyber war, assassinations, reputation attacks, and election interference, Russia is waging war against the United States. The war is in your backyard already. If you think that what happens in Ukraine doesn't affect you, you're wrong. if you think that, Russia is standing up for family values, that is such a joke. Oh my gosh, if you just do a little bit of reading, just a tiny bit of reading, you will find that Russia is no bastion of family values in any way, shape, or form. That's one more big disinformation campaign against the West. Now, I'm not trying to make the case that the United States is morally superior to Russia in terms of religion or anything like that, because we got our own problems, no doubt. But the point of this live is to explain to you, help you understand how Russia is currently committing acts of war against our country and the West. And so seeing Russia defeated in this contest is certainly a worthwhile goal. Now, Mama Rissa put up just a link to the link tree. Connie has spent hours working on the link tree over there yesterday and totally revamped it. So if you haven't looked at it in a while, there are links to some of the videos, like my visit to one of the biolabs in Ukraine, that you can go look at. Again, make sure that you go to chuckholton.com. Supporters over there are about to get some pretty awesome benefits because I'm about to release another documentary, and I'm just putting the finishing touches on a book that I've been working on for years that will be out before long too. And subscribers over at chuckholton.com get those for free. So if you want to have access to all that, go to chuckholton.com and become a supporter over there. But also click on that link tree and you'll see all kinds of good stuff as well. Chuck, why did Zelensky say 100 billion is missing? That's a good question. I was going to end right here, but let me answer that question. What Zelensky meant by that was, if you go back and look at the interview, look at the question that he was asked. The way it was posed to him is, the United States has given $170 billion to Ukraine. Where has all that money? What have you done with all that money? That was the question. And Zelensky said, we haven't received $170 billion, so I don't know where that $100 billion is. We've only received a little, it's actually been about 85 billion now. And the reason for that is because if the United States has pledged 170 billion, that is over a matter of years, going all the way out to 2032. So not all of it has been released yet. The vast majority of that money, about 85% of it, has stayed in the United States and has gone to American companies building things that we then send to Ukraine. So where Ukraine has gotten, for example, at one point, $3.8 billion of Presidential Drawdown Authority military equipment from the Pentagon. What I mean is, the military's got all this equipment, all this ammunition, Patriot missiles that are going to expire. They have an expiration date. And if we don't use them, once they get past their expiration date, they literally have to stick them in a hole and blow them up and then bury them, or give them away to some partner country. So the United States gave $3.8 billion of soon to expire ammunition and equipment from the Pentagon to Ukraine. Then they allocated almost $10 billion of funds, which they gave to the Pentagon to buy new equipment and new ammo. So if you just took that event right there, and if that interviewer had said to Vladimir Zelensky, you've received $3.8 billion of American equipment, what did you do with it? He could say, I can tell you exactly what we did with this. It went to the front line, it got used here, here, and here. But that wasn't the question that the interviewer asked. The interviewer asked the equivalent of, the United States has spent $9 billion on military equipment because of this war in Ukraine. What did you, Vladimir Zelensky, do with that $9 billion? And Zelensky's like, we didn't get $9 billion. We got $3.8 billion worth of equipment. I don't know where the other $6 billion went or $5 billion went. Okay, so that is not necessarily an indication of vast fraud, graft, or corruption. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the money was allocated by the US government to support the war in Ukraine. More than $5 billion already of that $170 billion that she was referencing has gone to support American troops in Poland and Hungary and places like that, because the United States surged US troops to the region to support NATO, just in case Russia decided to push through Ukraine and attack NATO. My son was one of those. He spent 10 months in Poland. Okay? So thank you, Danny. So again, it was just, in my opinion, it was from a fundamental misunderstanding of how that money was allocated in the first place. And it's not part of Zelensky's job to know where the United States spends money that it calls money to support Ukraine. It's only his job to account for the money that actually arrives in Ukraine, and that's a much smaller number. Does that make sense? Okay. Finally got to print your Death of Civilization book, but cannot get to pages 138 to 154. Okay, that's strange. Send me an email, info@holtonnews.com, and I will look into that and see what we can do about getting you the full version. Maybe we can just have Amy email you the PDF, the whole thing, and make sure you get the right thing. Amy's on here, so she'll get that. Thank you, Danny. Appreciate that. Please hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to the podcast, folks. And I think that's about it. That's as far back as I can go. So God bless you.